Great to see so many people registered.
So great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first Able Learning session hosted in partnership with Colorado Post and the Able Colorado team. We are all so happy to have you here and are so excited and grateful to all of the hardworking members of the Colorado team for helping us put together this event. My name is Lindy Hoffman, and I am a project coordinator with the Able National team at the Georgetown University Law Center. And I would like to take a minute to introduce some of the other folks who are joining us this afternoon. So first, I will start with the wonderful Elisa DiTrolio from the Denver Police Department. She is also serving as our statewide coordinator for the Able Colorado initiative. So before I introduce our two panelists, Abigail and Joel, Elisa, do you want to say a little bit about the Able Colorado program and some of the opportunities for agencies within the state?
Sure. Thanks so much, Lindy, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to attend and hear a little bit more about not only the social science experiments, but about Able Colorado. We're really proud of getting it to the point that it is. It really kind of came to be through several conversations with Georgetown about how do we not only just spread this program throughout Colorado, but how do we really support our smaller, more rural agencies that maybe don't have the staff, the resources? Well, nobody really has the money right now, but the money to dedicate to doing this. Denver, we're not necessarily doing it the best way, but we're just fortunate that we have almost 1,500 sworn, 300 civilians, and the resources really to implement on our own. But we recognize that, some departments in Colorado have 10 officers, and that's just not feasible. And also, and I think this really, no matter what part of the country you live, we really need to be supporting one another, law enforcement agencies. We know whether you are in a rural agency and the PD and the sheriff and maybe some surrounding jurisdictions respond, or you're Denver and you have the protests from 2020 and you have mutual aid requests where you have all metro agencies responding. We need to be able to not only learn how to work with each other's policies and procedures and practices tactically, but we need to have that trust and that faith in one another to intervene, whether it's a safety issue, whether it's a mistake or misconduct. So really what we're doing, and this is in part thanks to Georgetown, thanks to the Attorney General's office, Post, thanks to my department, and then several others have really stepped up to help. We've got Durango, Canyon, Thornton, to name a few that are really, what can we do? Can we help teach? Can we help fund? Can we help do whatever we can in the capacity that we have? And recently, CIRSA, which most of you are probably, that's your insurance provider. They cover all small to medium police departments in Colorado. They are funding several trainings throughout the state. They will be advertising that, and are paying instructors locally to come and provide this training for you. So we are going to be on the road coming to you. We also, of course, Georgetown is the expert, but please feel free to reach out to myself or any other Colorado folks that are already implementing to say, hey, how do I join? How do I become part of this? And how do I also pay it forward to help other agencies and help be a trainer or host a training? So yeah, we're just really excited at this initiative, and I could probably take the whole hour to talk about it, but I'm going to stop there. And if anybody needs any information or wants to learn more about an initiative, please reach out to myself, Lindy. Abigail lives here in Colorado, so she's a great resource. She's helped with the training, and we'll be providing trainings throughout. We just would love to not only talk to you about it, but have you take part, become part of this initiative.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Really appreciate that intro. Okay, so now I would love to introduce our two panelists, Dr. Abigail Tucker and Dr. Joel Dvoskin. Abigail is one of our national instructors and is a key member of the Able Colorado team. Abigail is a licensed psychologist located in Denver, Colorado. She is a clinical director at Community Reach Center in Thornton, Colorado, overseeing psychological services department, crisis services, jail-based service, and justice accountability and recovery program. In her current position, she works directly with psychologists practicing in the field of community mental health, psychological evaluation, a jail-based behavioral health program, an outpatient forensics program, a juvenile justice program, and the crisis intervention training program for local law enforcement. Dr. Tucker currently serves on her local community corrections board, the Colorado Behavioral Healthcare Council Criminal Justice Work Group, and is an active member of APA's Division 18. The focus of her ongoing research and practice includes forensics, community mental health, and emergency services mental health. Joel is a founding member of ABLE and is one of our national instructors. He is a clinical and forensic psychologist located in Tucson, Arizona. He was acting commissioner of mental health for the state of New York, has served as chair of the Nevada Governor's Advisory Council on Behavior, Health, and Wellness, and is the former president of 2 divisions of the American Psychological Association, including the American Psychology Law Society and Psychologists in Public Service. He served on the APA Policy Task Force on Reducing Gun Violence and on the APA Blue Ribbon Commission on Ethical Processes. Joel helped the New Orleans Police Department to create an innovative program to prevent police misconduct called EPIC, Ethical Policing is Courageous, and has helped the program grow and develop into the ABLE project at Georgetown today. In addition to many other accolades that Joel has received throughout his career, in 2020, Joel was awarded the Distinguished Contribution Award by the American Academy of Forensic Psychology, and have received similar awards from the Arizona Psychological Association for distinguished contributions to the science of psychology in 2001 and the practice of psychology in 2010. We are so grateful for their time. And with that, I will turn it over to Abigail and Joel, I believe, starting with Joel.
Thanks, Lindy, and thanks to Elisa and Lindy for putting this together. So my first assignment is to talk a little bit about why we teach social science experiments to police officers. It's a wonderful question, and you're going to get asked that. Before I start, however, I noticed Paul Noel's name on here. Paul is now the police chief in Knoxville, Tennessee, but in New Orleans, Paul was one of the people who made EPIC work from, I think, 2013 or sometime around then. Thank you, Paul, for being here today and for everything you've done for active bystandership. You are a hero to me.
Thank you, Joel.
So why do we teach this? Well, there's a few basic points you want to make clear. One of them is that police officers all have one thing in common. Every single one of them is a human being. And these experiments are about human beings. You can say, well, you know, we're different because we care. We serve and protect. Well, ministers serve and protect, or at least they serve. And yet one of the experiments is about wannabe ministers or priests or in one of the experiments. So the point is that these principles apply to everyone. We want to reinforce to you every chance you get when you're teaching the experiments to refer back to one of the case studies if you can. That every single one of the experiments and every single one of the case studies, there's one word that should jump out at you, which is the word responsibility. That when responsibility is shifted, when responsibility is acknowledged, when it's ignored, these are all things that affect whether or not people intervene to prevent harm. For example, in the hurry experiment, well, who's in a hurry? Nobody is in police officers. I understand there's downtimes, but man, when they're up, they are really up, and you got a sergeant in your ear screaming at you. How come you haven't called or responded to these 3 burglaries? And you're constantly in a hurry, and people miss things. And the experiments show that even though we want to be good active bystanders all the time, we're not. One of the quotes that's in your, if you haven't already, please read the social science supplement. One of the quotes you'll see in there is John Darley, who wrote, "If people understand the situational forces that make them hesitate to intervene, they may better overcome them." That's why we teach the experiments. That's why we play the inhibitor game, to make sure that if we don't acknowledge the inhibitors, it makes it so much harder to overcome them. In Dr. Staub's experiment number 4, we talk about how you can, by not intervening, you're making it cool to not intervene. You're creating a team of passive people. When you intervene, you're creating the cool team, which is the team that does intervene, the team that prevents harm. Remember, notice, decide, act, which is such an important part of our curriculum, and tie the experiments to notice, decide, act. So of course, I get spam every time I'm on Zoom and I forget to turn off my my phone ringer. Darley, in the experiment number 1, the first Darley experiment, Darley and Natanay, it talks about acting, when people actually intervene. In the second Darley experiment he did with Dan Batson, is about what we notice. If you're in a hurry, you don't notice things. The Milgram experiment is about how people decide whether or not to intervene or to do the right thing. In some cases, that means to decide not to do something, like not to administer a shock. So each of the experiments is related to notice, decide, act. And the last point is that why we teach the experiments is it's an opportunity every single time to stress the key learning objectives. And please do that. They're identified in the facilitator guide, they're identified in the social science supplement, and they're on your slides. So make sure we don't just teach the experiments like it's an introductory psych class, but to stress the key learning objectives and how they apply to police officers. Abigail.
Thanks, Joel. So what I'm going to do to pick up is try to offer a little bit of framework and logistics for how best to teach back social science experiments. But before I start, I want to prepare you for something that we're going to ask of you in a little bit here, which is, what are your questions? Joel and I have been teaching national instructors and statewide instructors for quite some time together. And we find that when people ask, well, this is where I'm really stuck, it makes for a much more fruitful discussion than if we just talk at you for an hour. So I want you to be thinking now, what are your questions? Because we are going to be asking you that for sure. The second thing I want to do is just keep in mind that this learning session is dropping right into the section of the curriculum that's all about why. If you remember from the curriculum design, it's designed to really follow how adults learn. And this is in the why section. Why does it work? The reason that I want to highlight that is because, to build off of what Joel was saying with why these social science experiments, it's to continue to double down on the fact that active bystandership works. Because you remember that later on in the curriculum, we're going to get to skills. We're going to find that it's true that active bystandership is a skill that can be learned, but this is really talking about why. So the next logistical thing I want to offer is, I did drop it into the chat for you folks here today. But if you do not, if you're fuzzy on what we mean, we're referring to some tools. We're talking about the Run a Show. Joel mentioned the facilitator guide. He mentioned the social science supplement. If you're fuzzy on what we mean by that, please do not hesitate to just ask. We want to make sure that you have access. It's in the portal. As instructors, you should all have access to that portal. These tools can be critically helpful when you're preparing yourself or when you want to brush up, especially if you have only taught maybe a couple of the science experiments and you're going to be up deck to teach another. You want those tools with you. So I dropped in one in the chat, but please don't hesitate to ask if you're unsure. Thank you so much, Linda. You read my mind there about how to access the portal and get these resources for yourself, and mainly where to go to get them when they get updated, right? So the last logistical thing before I really break down general tips to set up for structure, to have real confidence when you're teaching these, is for you just to reflect on how do you learn best? Are you the kind of person who learns best when you read something, when you read it to somebody else? Do you need nonverbal cues? Are you an interactive person? Do you need a visual? And the reason I say that is because the people who teach social science experiments the best are those who actually truly understand them themselves. If you are reading from the guide, if you're reading and you don't totally understand it, not only will that come across in how you teach, but it's going to be a real bummer when someone asks you a very specific question. So your first skill set to make sure you teach them really well is that you understand them well. And I see a lot of familiar faces here today. Some of you were taught by me, and absolutely no offense taken if when I taught it, you still don't get it. That's really common, but you got to take the time to understand it. And maybe that means you read it. Maybe that means you read it to somebody else. Maybe that means you practice it or you watch videos, but you want to make sure that you increase your competency and your confidence with it first. All right, so now I want to get into my very specific tools to outline and structure. For those of you who like to take notes, please feel free to do so. I will also follow up when I'm done and put some of this in the chat if that's helpful for folks as well. But my tips to structure your social science experiments for all 4 of them is exactly the same, and it's a 1, 2, 3, 4. Step 1 is your setup. This is your storytelling, right? You're giving the background. As Joel stated, you're no longer making it seem like you're just reading from an intro to psych class. You're trying to make it exciting. This is where you want to pull back on the same skills that you used in the case studies. You want to get comfortable. You want to use inflection in your voice. You want to really understand it and bring it to life. I will share with you folks that in this section 1, where you're setting it up, this is where the better you understand it, the more naturally it will come forward. The second part of setting up your social science experiments is where you're engaging the audience in guessing. Remember, it's sort of like a game show guessing game, and they're guessing the percentages, right? So this is part of the interactive piece. You have a couple of choices here. Your number one goal, though, is to get some interaction. So whether you get a raise of hands or you have people actually just shout out the answers, some people I see in person have them go and write it down up on a whiteboard, but you want to get people's guesses. Number 3 is that you are giving the results. This should be real fast, right? You're just letting them know what the answers are, right? It's part of the game show where you're letting them know what they want, folks. And the last part, folks, it is the most important part. It is the discussion. So I can't say enough that you need to practice your timing, because if in 1, 2, 3, you take up 15 minutes and then you're rushing your discussion, you will miss the opportunity to people to really spend time to connect the learning points to what you just took the time to set up. So again, that's 1, 2, 3, it's set up. Let's get the guessing games, show them the results. Thank you so much, Joel. And then the discussion. And then in the discussion, that is where you want to really make sure that you bring to life the learning objectives that Joel was talking about. And he gave some great tips already, but to make sure that everybody has it very clear, your tips in your discussion are, what case study does this remind you of, right? How does this relate to policing, right? So as Joel was talking about in the Hurry study, where does this relate to policing? You want to really start doubling down on those. If for no other reason, folks, don't make a liar out of yourself. When you did those case studies, you promised them, hey, we're not going to talk about this right now, but we're going to come back to these. So don't make a liar out of yourself. Come back to them. What case study does this remind you of, right? So now you're being true and you're bringing those case studies to life. So those are the 1, 2, 3, 4 to set yourself up. And then your discussion is, how does this relate to policing? Potentially, what case study does this remind you of? And the general discussion on what are the points to learn. So I want to pause first. And before Joel and I kind of proceed to some of the other tips that we have, are there any specific questions? Because if there's questions, we want to make sure we prioritize time for that versus anything else. So please feel free to raise your hand, come off mute. We are monitoring the chat as well, as I know we have a large audience today, but are there any questions? Pausing. Go ahead, Ron.
My partner Dot said that he has a question. You want to tell it to me, but he can't come off of mute.
I'm off of mute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I had a question. While we've been doing the social science experiments, the years that they were conducted, 1968, 1974, I mean, we're teaching recruits that were born in the 2000s. And we related to like these tests, these experiments were also repeated later on in the 80s, and they still don't understand because of just the years that, how long it was, these experiments. So I'm just wondering, is there any more that are more up to date that we can relate to our audience a little more?
Well, go ahead, Joel.
Every single one of the 4 experiments has been replicated numerous times, including recently. The reason why we teach the sort of the classics are that they set it up so well and so clearly. And in each one of the experiments, there was one thing they were studying. So when they looked at hurry, they kept everything else the same so they could see what the effect of hurry was, what the effect of other bystanders are. But one of the things you say is they've been replicated many times. There are some citations in the facilitator guide, but I don't think we've made any, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've done a recent update of all of the relevant studies, but they all say pretty much the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, and the only other thing that I would add to that, it's a great question, is that while certainly the research side of me agrees with Joel and wants to say, yeah, sure, yes, they've been replicated, right? I also want to be really clear about your audience. So my recommendation is for every single one of these experiments, particularly if you're thinking about the learning objectives, I would ask you to think of a real world experience, ideally something that is related to your department or policing, because you can open up the news, folks. I mean, I'm thinking about, actually, I get IACP's newsletter every single morning, right? Updates across the country. You can find examples of this every single day in our country. And sometimes that's a little bit more of a way to connect the learning objectives, that these were the social science experiments that studied them. And yes, they've been replicated, but the real takeaway here, folks, is that the things like pluralistic ignorance and that hurry impacts our active bystandership, right? That we are impacted by groups. It still happens every single day. So that would be a bigger recommendation, is just be ready of other examples that are in the real world to help people understand that the research might be tradition, but it's definitely not a historical takeaway. I hope that answers your question.
It did. Thank you so much.
You might even have a case, a McDonald, God forbid, but a McDonald in your own agency that people know about, or something that's been on the news in the last week. So you can make it more urgent and up to date that way.
Absolutely. Keith, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Kind of along the same lines as the last comment. So myself and one of my counterparts are teaching most of our recruits as well as our in-service. But we're finding that a lot of our younger recruits are also, just when we bring up the experiments, they've started talking about the Stanford Prison Experiment, especially when it was posted on Netflix. So we found, and I had never heard of it. So we found ourselves researching that a lot more to have a more timely discussion, even though that occurred in the 70s. So we found ourselves kind of talking about that in class, and it gets brought up often. I just want to try and get your all take on adding that into the class as more of an example that we're doing.
Go ahead.
Joel and I are both playing the like, no, you tell them, no, you tell them. So I will tell you, Keith, I'm very glad that you asked this question. In fact, to the point that I need to make a note and just actually maybe follow back up with our ABLE crew, because when it doesn't get asked, then I think we missed the opportunity to provide this education. So thank you for asking. To be blunt, I would not use that as an example. And that's for a couple of different reasons. Predominantly because, and again, for those of you who've been taught by me, you know that for example, in the Milgram experiment, there were ethical considerations and concerns that came out of that experiment. And because of that, standards have changed, right? But Stanley Milgram has been very, what's the word, a part of that change, right? Owning and identifying, right? Like that the intention was not to have harm to participants. And there was some harm to the people who participated in the prison.
Stanford.
I don't want to call Stanford. I know I don't want to call it an experiment, Joel. I'm trying to think of a better word.
It was a demonstration.
Demonstration. I'm going to actually let Joel explain the difference because he does a better job than I do about why we don't call it an experiment, because that's the other reason, right? We really wanted, that's part of that history. We wanted you to have true social science that meets the criteria for experiments as opposed to this demonstration. But one of the other things about the Stanford prison demonstration is that there were harm to those participants as well. But it's in the Milgram, I can really explain how Milgram took ownership for that, how standards were changed, how things, and you'll see in the replicated studies why it's a little bit different. It's also the other reason why we use the original one as well. But the other thing about the Stanford demonstration is that in addition to the fact that the experiment issues, it's a little bit confusing and overlapping messages that you could take from that, right? And for the messages that we are trying to pull forward here in ABLE, it actually almost undermines what we're trying to present, although certainly there's that demonstration of influence. Joel, do you want to talk a little bit more about why you and I would not refer to it as an experiment?
I'm going to be very blunt. This is ABLE. We always tell the truth. I hate the Stanford prison quote unquote experiment. I don't think it's honest. They purported to be saying this is what prison does. And all they demonstrated is if you try hard enough, you can get Stanford undergraduates to act stupid. That's what they proved. They were trying to get people to be mean and unkind to each other. So we have no idea what actually was due to the fact that they thought they knew they weren't in jail. And the lead researcher, Dr. Zimbardo, was the quote warden who was telling people what to do. So it's just, I think it's done a lot of harm and it's insulting to people who work in prisons. And it was a wonderful opportunity to learn something that was lost. So I'd never teach it except the way you just heard.
Does that help, Keith?
I appreciate it does. And again, I've read several of the papers that had said he falsified a lot of the stuff and there's a lot of doubt in it, but it gets brought up so often. That's why I wanted to bring it up. So thank you for that.
Thanks
Oh,
for
you
bringing
bet.
it up.
Yeah, and it does all the time because it's very, and I'm using air quotes here, right? It's popular. And so there's a distinction between popular and some of the values we're trying to get across. One of the things you said, Keith, though, and certainly if there's other questions, this has been fantastic. I'm looking at right now, the breakdown, and keep in mind that while there's a lot to learn in every single social science experiment, remember the key points, right? So, in the Milgram one, we're really talking about that obedience to authority, right? Darley and Batson, we're talking about being in a rush, right? Then we're talking about the pluralistic ignorance and having other people around. We want you to really remember the key learning objective for each one. And we think that will help folks not only come up with your own real world examples of that, but also, there is this balance of telling a story and bringing people in and making it entertaining, but we don't want people to get lost and miss the point. So that's why when you know up front what your point is, I want people to know that sometimes we defer to authority even when we know better. That's the key point, right? And then that point won't get as lost as you're trying to kind of pull people through. Lindy has a great question here in the chat.
Great question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to read it. Could you give us an example of something an instructor could say to get back on track if someone brings up the Stanford demonstration? Great question, Lindy. Joel, do you want to take it or do you want me to start?
You go first.
All right. I usually start by very similar to what you all just saw here. I thank them for bringing it up. I acknowledge that it's very popular and that they must be curious if they're finding it. And then I say, The concern, however, and the reason that we don't bring this in is because from a true social science experiment, there's factors of that demonstration that don't meet our standards for social psychology that we want. And again, we are really trying to stay true to pulling out specific learning points that pertain to active bystandership. While I'm not going to argue that there might be some interesting takeaways from the Stanford prison demonstration, it doesn't have a direct tie without some of the confounding variables that have the psychologist concern. That's how I change it back. However, I want to say how I've watched a law enforcement peer. So I watched a law enforcement peer when that question come up as saying, you know, it is really interesting. I've seen it's really popular. Thanks for bringing it up. Everybody always asks, but my social psychology friends tell me that it doesn't really meet the muster for a true social science experiment, and that there's a lot of concerns with how that research is brought forward, and integrity is a really important value to ABLE, which is why it's not included. Then a great opportunity then is to ask them, what is it that they were trying to get at, point out, or pull out from that, and then see if you can attach it to what we've had. Because if they're talking about, for example, obedience to authority, great, then let's pull that back to the Milgram experiment. So that's, the real thing is to thank them, clarify it's based on the integrity of research as to why we don't include it, but what was it that they were really trying to bring forward with that, and how can we connect it to our course material?
I have nothing to add. That's exactly what I wish I would have said. Probably not that well, but that's a great answer.
All right, well, folks, I'm sorry, when Joel agrees with me twice in one day, I kind of make it a rule to just shut it down for the day, because that doesn't happen that often. So I think we're just gonna have to be done. All right, how about other questions that folks have? We certainly have some other content we'd be happy to cover, but these questions are really great and we want to keep them coming. Okay. All right, so what the additional content that we'd like to cover is that we want to make sure that I want to do a little bit more for logistics. And then Joel and I are going to kind of go back and forth again. We're going to keep pausing in case there's questions, but we want to make sure that people really do understand the key takeaway for each experiment. We've been talking about them high level, but we want to make this a genuine refresher in that sense. But one of the other very logistical points when it comes to preparing for these social science experiments is the comfort with your PowerPoint presentation. So if that's one of the things that when I'm training folks, I say, first, you got to learn them. So remember, my original feedback is make sure you understand them, read all about them, watch some videos, teach them with others. You got to make sure you understand them really well. The second part is you can use that 1, 2, 3, 4 if it's helpful, but generally understand how you're going to present them, even if you didn't have a PowerPoint. And I'll tell you folks, that's a great standard for most of this curriculum, this social science experiments notwithstanding. So practice with your family members, practice with your training partner, practice to your dog. But when you can tell a social science experiment, like it's a story around the dinner table or at the bar, without a PowerPoint slide, then you're going to be knocking it out of the park. So that really should be your standard. However, there's nothing like tripping over a PowerPoint to make you look like you don't know what you're talking about, even when you do. Been there, done that myself. So once you get to that comfort and confidence of being able to deliver these even without the PowerPoint slides, then what I would suggest is just practicing with the PowerPoint slides and making sure that you or if you're using a training partner are aligned in that. So again, because keeping in mind the 1, 2, 3, 4 is the setup, getting some engagement, results, and discussion, how the results pop up on the PowerPoint. If you're not prepared for how they're going to do it, you could feel rushed. So really just make sure that you take time and use the PowerPoint to your advantage. It's set up to help you, but if you're not prepared for it, it could trip you up and slow you down on that part. The discussion too, just as a reminder to folks, the discussion is going to include that wonderful cue that they all have at the bottom left-hand side. It's going to say large group discussion of the PowerPoint, right? Like they are here to help you. So let it help you, right? You do not need to. I'm going to actually show you because I just can't help myself. So let it help you. Oh, I can't share my screen. Well, if that is an option, then do that would be awesome. If not, I understand. But keep in mind that in the PowerPoint slide that is for the discussion point, it actually says large group discussion at the end. It's why the PowerPoint slide is blank when you pull it up, so that you don't just give people the answer, that you are asking them for their feedback. Thank you so much, Lindy. So just hopefully you see if this is the first one, right? What does this help us understand? When I very first pull it up, there are no bullets because you're not supposed to give away, don't give away the farm, people. Ask them, what do you think? And get them, because remember, you're in this section where you want them to start talking. And then as people start talking, you can click and your points will come up. I want to pause again and see if there's any questions that folks have. Also, while I take my sip of water. All right. Oh, great question. Any tips for engaging the discussion and getting it started? Well, my first question is, do any of you have any feedback for your peers on that? What works for you when you're trying to start off the discussion and get it going? Feel free to come off mute, raise your hand. All right, well, we would love to hear from you if you've got some suggestions, folks, on how to do that. But I mean, my number one tip to get a discussion going is to ask a question and then stop talking. I don't know about you all, but I have a really bad habit of asking a question and then, heaven forbid, there's a little bit of silence and I ask another question and I ask it a different way. Yeah, absolutely. So wait for that awkward silence. Go ahead, Joel.
I think there's a sweet spot where you wait. If you wait too long, you can lose the class's attention. But if you don't wait long enough, you take them off the hook and they don't give you answers. So learn yourself what your sweet spot is of how long you can wait. So it should be a little awkward, just where you feel a little bit of pressure, but not so long that you see them start to look around, drift their attention, or try to sneak a look at their phone. That's one tip. The second one is, think about if they look confused. We don't always ask the question well. Think about restating the question in another way, because your goal is to get them to say the right answer so that you can reinforce the hell out of them. That's the best way for them to learn and remember what they learned. So if you can think about maybe 1 or 2 or 3 different ways to ask the question. Diffusion of responsibility, that's a fancy word we use, but the concept people understand. So if you can get them to say the word responsibility, then you get to say, well, we have a term for that. And now they feel good because they came up with the right answer. One other suggestion has to do with, Abigail explained about getting their guesses. One of the neat things about this is you get to pick who to call on to explain their logic of their guesses. So you can pick, if it's not going well, you pick one of the stars of your class and say, Abigail, you said 20%. What was your thinking? Because you know you're going to get a thoughtful answer, as opposed to randomly selecting people who maybe are lost. Those are just 3 examples, but I think it's good to have a few tricks in your back pocket so that when the silence goes on too long, instead of giving them the answer, which is sort of declaring defeat, to ask a different question that's going to be a little bit more of a leading question to help them get to the right answer.
Absolutely, Joel. And there was a great tip in the chat from Robin about the more you remind your class that the class is better with discussion. Excellent tip, Robin, because what you're doing there is you're setting up the expectation and then you're reinforcing it. And then you get to total behavior psychologist tip here is that reinforce the behavior you wish to continue. So if on the very first discussion, one person actually raises their hand, and even if they say Stanford experiment, that's not at all what you wanted them to say, you're still going to say, thank you, Joel. Appreciate you chiming in there. And then you're going to kind of help connect it back to the content, right? So generally speaking, you want to thank people for responding, use names appropriately, and connect it back to the content, even if it's not the answer you were expecting, because that will increase the likelihood that others will participate as well.
That may be the single biggest difference between great teachers and good teachers, is the ability to reinforce people with enthusiasm and in a meaningful way. If the answer is stupid, don't say good answer. Figure out a way to reinforce them. But thank you. Thanks for jumping in here, because we needed to get the conversation started. Any other thoughts so that people feel good about what Abigail just said? If you're taking notes, write it down. People do more of what they get reinforced for.
Robert, absolutely great in the chat there. Why a low percentage and why a high percentage? You're so right. That gets people going. It gets them to say more. And what's great is that you're getting them to say more about something that they already agree. They're agreeing with themselves. So they don't have to come up with an answer. They don't have to be right or wrong. And what's not really fantastic, Robert, about how you're doing that is that it's clear that you're trying to say, let's get a little bit of conversation and discussion going on here. So nobody has to be right and wrong. It's the number one reason that people, well, barring, general assuming good intent of people, the number one reason people don't answer, raise their hand and participate is because they're afraid of being wrong. Even cops are afraid of being wrong or afraid of having a stupid answer. And so when you can make it that there is no such thing and you can tie it back to the content, you increase the likelihood that they'll engage. So that's a great tip, Robert. Thank you.
Even if their number is grossly high or low, if you ask them, did yours go up or down in the second one, they can still be right, even if they were way off on the number, but they were right that their second guess was lower than their first guess. And you can encourage them to talk about why that happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Another tip I like to offer for having great discussion, I did put some just questions in the chat that you could ask, right? So that, they're the great discussion starters are, what does this help us understand? Why am I teaching this? Why is it important? How does this relate to policing? What case study does this remind us of? Those are all great discussion starters. Keep in mind that you'd ask one question and then take a deep breath, let people at least attempt to answer before you'd move on the others. But the other one, folks, and some of you who've trained with me know that I like to do this, especially when I'm in person, which is my favorite way to teach, which is get people non-verbally involved. So when I do almost all of these experiments, if I have the time to do it, and I work with my partner, is that I actually bring people up to the front of the room. So I ask people at a break, hey, I'm going to be doing some social science experiments. You literally just have to volunteer to stand or sit in the front of the room, and I'm going to sort of use you as the person in the experiment. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to. You just kind of got to let me move it around, right? And so for the Stanley Milgram one, I put two people back to back sitting in chairs, and I name one person the teacher and one person the learner, and I use their names. So if I'm, building off of today, I might use Ron and Michael, right? So if Ron and Michael were my two people up at the front, I'd have them back to back in their chairs for the Milgram experiment. And I would make an early switch that I would make, for example, Ron the teacher and Michael the learner, and I keep reinforcing that. Because when it comes time for discussion, I don't say, what does this help us learn? I then say, folks, how can we make things different here for Michael, the poor learner? Man, he got the tough straw. What do we want to do? How do we make it different? And then that makes it more fun and engaging because people want to respond typically for their peers, right? Like, oh yeah, bummer, Michael got the learner end of that stick or the teacher end of that stick, right? And now you've made it more engaging. you've non-verbally pulled people into it. Also, when you do a little nonverbal setup of people in the front of the room, for your learners who are not semantic, they don't learn with words, they learn better by seeing, they're actually going to understand it better, even if they weren't physically sitting up there. And it makes the discussion more engaging as well. So if you have the opportunity to use some of your folks as sort of your pawns in setting up the research study at the front of the room, that can go a long way with just naturally building people in. Plus, my other reason that I like to do that is I specifically at that break, because keep in mind, I'm looking at the run a show right now. There is a break right before the social science experiments, right? So you cover the why does this work? They did a little small group activity. They're out on break. And by this time, I kind of know who are my quiet but engaged people. And I'm actually picking somebody who I think is engaged. They're just not a hand raiser. They're not the kind of person that's going to be raising their hand. So this is a way for them to participate in the class, and they don't have to speak if they're not comfortable with it. So lots of great tips to do that. Right, let me pause there, and I'm just going to check the chat, see if there's other questions, but also feel free to come off mute if people have specific questions. Yeah, great point, Joel. You can use any of the case studies. That's another example that case studies are never wrong. If somebody remembers the case study, figure out a way to make it right. Figure out a way to attach it. What are people's tricks? Feel free to use the chat or come off mute about how you keep case studies fresh, present of mind throughout the entire curriculum. What are your tips and tricks to make sure that they don't get forgotten until the very end of the curriculum? I know for myself, I'm a big fan of actually having somebody in the class write it down. Yeah, absolutely, David. Great example. I
Good.
have one of my participants write on the dry erase boards. That's perfect. Yep, that's a great one. Sometimes people have, they make posters that they hold up and they use. I've often also just seen people say, one other tip that I've seen that I think is really smart is every time you say, what case study does this remind us of? Rattle them off, right? Lopez, McDonald, Jensen, because they might not have the names connected yet. And so every time you ask, what case study does this remind us of? Rattle off all three. And that way people don't have to remember which one it was. And you're more likely that they'll remember at the end of the class for sure. All right. So the final piece of just important content that I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page with before we then really move into a Q&A is you've heard us talk about at high level. What are your key learning objectives and what are the parallel to policing? So let's make sure we briefly do each one. So on the first one, the Darley and Latané, keep in mind that in Darley and Latané, the key takeaway here, we just reviewed this, right, is that when other people are around, it influences our decision-making, right? That diffusion of responsibility, someone else will do it, or pluralistic ignorance, no one else seems to think anything is wrong, so it must be okay, right? This is the one where you have multiple people on the intercom, and the more people it is, the less likely people were willing to take action. So your key learning point there is that bystanders are less likely to take action when they think someone else will do so. My question to you all, please feel free to come off mute or use the chat. What is a day-to-day common example in policing of that? Give me a day-to-day common example in policing where bystanders, meaning police officers, are less likely to intervene on their peers when they think that others are going to do so or they're in a better position to do it. Any thoughts? Because this will be helpful to learn from each other and have these examples ready in case you get questions from your class. I always love when I can tell that people are like leaning into type. Ron, what do you got?
So I was going to say it's more or less when a group of people are around supervisors and they know that that supervisor is typically like that, or that's his comment. way of practice. That's when I figure people are less likely to intervene or help out with something.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great example. And one of the other specific things that I heard you say, Ron, is that I do think is important is sometimes it depends on who it is, right? They might act differently if it's peers around versus supervisors around, but that absolutely has an impact for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, like when I say that, I'm talking about not just officers to supervisors, but when that one specific officer is around a group of supervisors and things are going awry, they're less likely to intervene or help out.
And that can relate to several of the experiments. It's bystanders, it's authority. So you can tie those, you can use an example and tie it to more than one experiment if it's relevant, and as it is in that case.
Yeah. And Ernesto's, your example is also a great one that could also be both groups as well as authority figures. Thank you for that. I'm curious if anybody has an example that doesn't also have authority. And a common everyday example in law enforcement where having peers, maybe groups of other officers, will decrease the likelihood that an officer will intervene and take action to prevent or stop or lessen harm that is occurring. Go ahead, Keith. Oh, maybe you accidentally came off mute.
No, I was trying to also raise the hand button, but it didn't work for me. Yeah, no. So I've seen it historically over my career when it comes to more internal, when it's like EEO type violations, where officers are less likely to make that intervention during an EEO, whether or not they know it falls in the policy or just that peer pressure of they don't want to be that odd person out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Keith. All right, Joel, I'm going to hand it over to you for the next one. Same kind of content.
So the Darley and Batson experiment, that was relatively simple, but it's so important for policing and so important to tie it to policing. So the learning point is that being in a hurry makes you less likely to intervene to prevent harm, makes you less likely to be an active bystander. Why is that? A lot of police officers are familiar with the term tunnel vision. As a teacher, you're going to teach them to think about the fact that all of the senses can be affected in the same way, even time sense. So when I read competing accounts of an episode and one officer says it was a minute and the other officer says it was 4 minutes, and somebody says, well, one of them's lying, that might not be true. Because when people are in a hurry, especially when they're in fight or flight mode and in a hurry, they're likely to get time wrong. They're likely to not hear things. They're not likely to see things, and all the senses can be affected. So we call that sensory exclusion. It also means that we're less likely to attend to the things, even if we see them, because we're in a hurry. So this one, to me, is really easy to tie to policing. So whether you want to raise your hand or go into a chat, how do you tie that to policing? How do you tie Darley and Batson to policing? Or just come off mute. Any thoughts about that?
I usually use an example of you're on your way to a call, and it's potentially a hot call for service. It came out, you've been asked to respond code 1, and en route you're driving down a main thoroughfare and you drive right past a fight in progress with a weapon being involved, and you don't even see it. But then the call comes out that there's a fight in progress, and you're like, I was just on that route, I didn't see anything wrong, and you key up over the radio. But here at VCU, we're lucky enough to have a ton of cameras, and most of our campus is covered by cameras, and we're able to see those things happen. I don't know how many times I've seen doing an investigation, oddly enough, an officer drove past a suspect before the suspect identification came out, but it happened.
David, I can't imagine a better example than that. That is a spectacularly useful example. And I'll bet almost everybody in the call has that almost that exact example in their own experience. And one of the things, well, any other thoughts about that before I start yapping? Any other thoughts about how you tie it to law enforcement, to your world, your life?
Hello?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I
Truman?
just had one quick one just to add on to what he said. I use the example of when you're getting off of work and someone's flagging you down, but you have other things to do at home and you're in a rush to get home, but someone needs you while you're still trying to get off on time. So I use that one also. I use that one all the time.
It's perfect. Those are great examples. And then more generally, who's in a hurry a lot? Police officers. Not all the time, but when it's busy, you're the sergeants in your ear screaming at you to get moving and clear this case and get to the next one, and citizens screaming because they called 911 10 minutes ago. Where are you? So a lot happens. The last point I'll make about this one is later on in the curriculum, when we show the video, the Seattle video where the officer has a knee on the neck and officer number 2 pulls it off. I always say, I ask the class, do you think officer number 1 could hear the crowd yelling, get your effing knee off of his neck? Because I've watched that at least 200 times. I don't believe he heard them. I think he was so focused that he didn't hear them. And again, that's an example. So Abigail, you want to do the next one?
Yeah.
I will bring up officer safety in this part because when they get into a hurry and tunnel vision, I try to link that with it because I know of an incident where Dave's talked about it, you're going down Broad Street, whatever, and goes, we had officers go to a hot call and actually run and walk by the subject who was holding a gun and he didn't even see it. And he stood there waiting on him. And he's like, well, I guess they don't want to talk to me. And he walks off. But so I try to tie that in there. And when you do that, that kind of brings it into a reality to them and kind of brings it more to things that they, oh yeah, I can see how that could be.
That's a great observation, Bob. And something you can do at almost any point in the curriculum is tie it to officer safety.
And we want you to do that. Absolutely. We want people to connect, remember ABLE learnings to all their aspects of policing. So actually, you all gave some fantastic examples in the chat for the Milgram, which is how we respond to real or perceived authority figures, direct and indirect. You used FTOs, master training officers, rank, seniority. So you all are so great on that one. And in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to just the last one, which is the Dr. Staub experiment, right? And this is the one where we see that there can be a positive evolution when positive action is taken. And remember, your key points on this one is that action breeds action and inaction breeds inaction, right? So that you can use social pressure to pull people in. So I'm curious if people have an example for us about where you might see that in policing. Everyday policing, where might you see that action breeds action?
I can give one.
Please.
The example I typically use is I helped set up our first aid training years ago in the department. And I use the American Hearts version 2 when they tell someone when someone's having a heart attack or in distress, the AED scenario where it's you tell one person to call 911, another person to get an AED, and then while that person is attempting to render aid, the AEDs.
Great example, Keith. Thank you. Yes. And I think what I also like about that is you're tying it to something else that they'll know, right? Hey, you remember you learned this already, right? You go get the AED, you call 911, you flag down the ambulance, right? And giving everybody high direction helps people engage out of that. So fantastic example, Keith. And my last tip there is just have something ready. Have a very day-to-day, something that people can relate to, have something ready on that. So to kind of transition us here is that Joel and I could literally talk about this for hours, and true to form in Able Sense, we are going to stick around in case there are questions, but we also want to be respectful and mindful that you all allotted an hour and we are exactly at top of the hour. And so I just want to extend my sincere gratitude for the work that you all do every single day. Thank you so much. And we wish you health and safety. Joel, any
Thanks,
closing
everybody.
words?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Abigail and Joel. This has been such an excellent session. I just want to quickly make an announcement before everyone gets off of the session. We are going to be hosting these learning sessions every month going forward. The next learning session is going to be on May 11th at 1 p.m. Mountain Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will be focused on responding to pushback from officers at your agency. And the session is going to be hosted by Lieutenant Chris Fusetti from Thornton Police Department and Denver Police Department's Elisa DiTrolio. And we'll be sending around an email with the registration link. So please keep your eye out for that in the next couple of weeks. So like Abigail said, thank you all so much for joining us. Special thank you to our fabulous instructors for a very informative session. And we'll be sticking around for any outstanding questions. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend.